So today what I'm going to talk about is I'm going to try to do 4 graduate student theses in 20 minutes. So knowing me, I usually can do it. But what we're going to do is we're going to take a walk through the ecology of the Ferruginous Hawk, what we know about it, why it's an issue in terms of oil and gas development, some of the concerns that we have, and talk a little bit about the criteria that people have used to try to help the species out and what some of the constraints are based on that. So just to inform you, Ferruginous Hawk, it's a prairie raptor. It's one of the largest raptors actually in the Canadian prairies. Slightly smaller than a bald eagle, but bigger than a Swainson's hawk. Best way to think about it. And over the past basically 20 to 30 years, they've declined in Alberta. So the provincial government has monitored them since the 1970s, and the density has been reduced, the range is reduced by about 50% in both of those metrics. So that's led to concerns that something's going on, we need to do something about it. The instant response by the government when an animal goes into decline, particularly a bird that has a residence, okay, is to create what's called a setback distance. And the idea of a setback is it's a distance that within that bounds activities of humans should be limited. Now that could be oil and gas development is not allowed, drilling is not allowed, even maintenance activities might not be allowed, depending on the animal, depending on the setback, and depending on the sensitivity. Now this comes from the Species at Risk Act, which basically defines a residence as a dwelling place such as a den, nest, or other similar area or place that is occupied or habitually occupied by one or more individuals during all part of their life cycles, including rearing, wintering, feeding, or hibernating. So the goal of putting a setback distance around a Ferruginous hawk nest is to limit the chance that we're going to cause that bird to fail. And what we're trying to do is, limit the possibility that human activities are going to have a negative effect on the species. Now, in Alberta and in Saskatchewan, where this bird is common was once common in the Canadian prairie, we've used these basic setback distances. They're combined with temporal constraints about the timing of different activities. So those activities, they have 3 criteria: low, medium, and high. Low would be things like somebody going to visit a well. High would be something like drilling a well. And basically between March and July in a given calendar year, there's a kilometer setback on a nest like that. And so in the Canadian prairie, basically you're not allowed to operate within that distance. Now, during other times of the year, the boundaries change. So when the hawks aren't there, high-level activities like building, for example, a compressor station or something like that, would not be deemed allowed. But other activities, maybe, again, maintenance schedules and things like that, they're certainly allowed to go on near the nest. Now, Saskatchewan has slightly different guidelines, but again, same rationale. Now, this obviously puts constraints on industry, both in the timing and the distance at which they can operate. And so the question has been, how are these guidelines effective or not? And how we answer that question depends very much on the kind of data you collect. So what we've been doing is trying to test whether the government's precautionary principle that they're applying, it works well or not. The literature, to be honest, that was used to define these setback distances is relatively limited and quite anecdotal. There's never been a comprehensive study of Ferruginous hawk ecology in the Canadian prairies, so we decided to actually do it. We do know from other studies the Ferruginous hawk is sensitive, but the key question is, are they sensitive to people and their activities, in other words, what I call the foot, or are they sensitive more to the footprint, the disturbances, the physical structures, those kind of things? So our study really revolves around trying to separate or understand the relative importance of those 2 things. So the basic project goals are very broad, and I'm going to highlight at a very high level kind of a little bit what we learned about each one of these. We've basically been collecting data now for 3 years. This was the last year of field season was last year, so we're now in the midst of wrapping up and writing up our final report. So what I'm going to talk about today are kind of our preliminary recommendations, but a report will be out kind of come this summer, or summer 2014. What we've been doing is looking at whether or not density of Ferruginous hawks differs as a function of footprint within a township. So that's a very important metric. What's the size of the population in areas that have different levels of impact? Now, when you have density, though, are the birds doing okay? Are they reproducing? Are they surviving? Or in high energy sector areas, are they having, or having low juvenile survival or low nest survival, things like that? As well, another metric that people often use is how do the birds behave? Do they avoid going near a well pad, or do they use it, right? So we're looking at how males move around in the landscape. Now, because these nests are in one place, and they're actually multi-year nests, in other words, they're often started by a crow or a raven, then the hawk takes over, builds it up for a bit, Actually, what we're finding is a little bit is the Canada geese are stealing them from the hawks after that, which is a little bit weird, but we can talk about that later. So we're looking at also how these nests are being used over time. So how long does this setback have to be in place for the bird? And then we're also looking at how the behavior of the birds, and this is how actually the setback distances were defined in the first place, how are they reacting to people actually being out there disturbing them, and what does that do? So in a nutshell, what we really have is a design where we're studying all of those different metrics along a gradient from low, medium, to high industry. So we've got landscapes that are as pristine as possible, things like the Suffield Basin, for example, and then we've got the areas that have very high oil and gas plays. But at the same time, the other major driver, and we know this already, is cropland, conversion to agriculture. That's a competition for Ferruginous hawk habitat, so we're also looking at it from a perspective of low to high cropland. And this allows us to look at the interaction, so the cumulative effects of these two very different activities, trying to separate and understand the relative importance of each to the birds. So what we've been doing, and then this year we put a lot of effort into density surveys. So again, this would be about the Manitoba border. That's the edge of the foothills. This is Cypress Hills, to give you a perspective. This is the range of the Ferruginous hawk, and you can see it here in the... What we've done is we've gone to all of these blocks, and we have approximately 159 surveys in 2013, and we have 59 in 2012. And what we've been looking at, and these are basically based on that strata, we have high, low of these different levels of impact. And we drive around and we look for as many hawk nests as we possibly can find. And what we've generally found is that agriculture is the primary driver of where you're going to find them. By the time you hit about 40 to 35% grassland remaining, the birds start to drop out of the system. So agriculture is a primary driver. When we look at the energy sector footprint, we find a very flat line. There's a slight decrease in density, but it is very, very shallow, and it's not statistically significant. So again, very shallow density, okay, the birds are not being strongly negatively affected by the energy sector pattern that we see. Now, we've been tracking nests. Between 2010 and 2012, we tracked over 613 nests. In 2013, we found 485. So we're monitoring all kinds of stuff: nest outcome, fledging rate, arrival date, fledging date, a variety of things. And what we're able to do with this is figure out whether or not the birds are doing well or not. What we've learned is, in fact, something that's quite concerning to us is one of the major reasons the birds aren't doing well is a lot of the nests are failing. And what I mean by that is the nest literally is falling out of the tree. And so any activity that has a negative ability of the tree to be withstanding the weather and things like that is a significant concern. Because over 25% of our failures are caused by the tree collapsing and the nest falling out. The giant windstorm, the thing that kind of kicked you guys in the ass this summer called the floods, it kind of also was very negative on the hawks, actually, especially in the Pincher Creek area. The wind was enough to blow a vast majority of the nests out of the tree. But if they're not getting blown out of the tree, the nest success is about 75%, which should create a stable population. They're about 1.8 young, and we haven't seen extremely strong patterns of differential nest success as a function of energy sector impact. Now, this is only using our 2012 data. We haven't added 2013 in yet. One of the patterns we did see is that in a couple of the heavy oil areas where there's a lot of activity going on, we had a slight evidence of lower reproductive success. We're still completing that to see if that pattern holds or not. And I'll talk a little bit more about why that's important in a second. Now, something that's also a little bit alarming is we think that a new predator in the system may be starting to have a negative effect on them. So I'll let you guess in just a second. I should put context. This is the middle of the night. That's the hawk nest right about here, and there's a bird, there's a juvenile sitting there. And in a couple seconds, you're going to see a few things change. So here you got some eyes. There's two of them. Oh, is it playing? Yeah, it's playing. It should be. No, it stopped. I'll do it again. Hopefully. There come the eyes. Here comes his buddy's eyes. And you're going to see just in a second, it is a raccoon. And they're hunting in groups. And you can watch the depressing poor hawk's fate in a moment. But this is something that has not been demonstrated before. And the two dominant predators of the hawks, they're a big bird. You would think they could defend themselves, but seem to be raccoons coming into the nest and great horned owls. both of which do react to human activities. Great horned owls particularly, and raccoons like the abandoned farms. How that plays into energy sector activity, we have no idea. Whether or not energy sector activities are influencing the distribution of those predators is not something we know, but there goes the hawk out of the nest. Goodbye. All right, so moving on to something not quite so sad. Well, actually it is pretty sad. Adult mortality and movement. So we now have technology that's amazing. It's these are called a CGSM transmitter. They have a solar panel on the back. They basically talk to cell phone towers. So these birds can, we put them on their back, and every time they get in range of a cell phone tower, dials it up, calls it, sends the data to us, and we know exactly where they are and what's going on with them. So we fitted 25 males with these or Argos GPS ones, and what we found is that 5 males have died, which for a long-lived bird like this is actually quite high. Interestingly, none of them died on the breeding grounds. They all survived the breeding season in Alberta and Saskatchewan quite nicely, but 2 have been hit by cars, 1 was shot, 1 was electrocuted, and 1 was poisoned. So that's quite a high rate of mortality for a long-lived bird like this. So that may be one of the reasons that we're seeing these patterns. Okay. Some of the things that we're doing here, we have high oil and gas. So we're also able to look at their behavior. So this is the home range of one of the birds over the breeding season. We have about 17,000 points go into this, and so we can look at whether or not the birds are avoiding all these dots or the wells in this very active area, whether or not they avoid the wells or things like that. We can also look at their home range size. So we are seeing a difference in home range size between native and cropland, but it's not statistically significant. We're looking at home range sizes in different energy sectors, so low versus high, no difference. And one of the things that we're seeing is that there are 2 kinds of Ferruginous hawks. There are the Greenpeace Ferruginous hawks, and there are the PTAC Ferruginous hawks. And it sounds like a joke, but it's not. It's true. We have a group that they do not like energy sector activity, and we have a group that really like it. They'll perch on wellheads, they'll perch on shacks, they'll do all kinds of stuff. And their behavior is very different. And so what this does is, on average, there's no effect of energy sector activity on how the adult males move. But some of them really don't like it for some reason, and some do. And we don't understand what attributes, what makes one like it more than another. But I'll come back to this PTAC and Greenpeace Ferruginous hawk thing in a moment, because it is actually quite an interesting behavior. As I showed you before, in terms of a little less relevant directly to us in terms of our energy sector thing, but because these things go on the birds for multiple years, we're able to track them on their migratory routes. And so we can now start to talk a little bit more about what might be happening to them elsewhere. So what we've got is basically 2 migratory routes we've established. One is that they go on the east side of the Rockies, and they kind of go down through the prairie system. Most of them are going to places like Texas. We got another group, though, that seems to be going down the other side of the Rockies and going into Mexico. And so looking at, and what we're going to be doing soon, is looking at, well, what kind of activities and how are they reacting to things on the wintering grounds at the same time. The wintering grounds, though, they seem to be surviving quite nicely. They seem to be taking it on the chin during migration. They really shouldn't go to Utah. That's my one thing I got to tell the Ferruginous Hawks. So summary of footprint. Just want to wrap that up quick. Basically, there's relatively little pattern that shows very strong effects on movement and reproductive success from energy sector activity. Now, I'm not going to say that's our final recommendation, but it's not a massive effect size. It might be small percentage changes. Agricultural conversion, on the other hand, is definitely an issue. We'll talk a little bit more about that in my 2 minutes. So, do we need setbacks? Now, that data is not even how setbacks were created in the first place. That's the first data of its kind to talk about how birds react to demographically and movement-wise to energy sector activity. The setbacks came from a series of studies that were done in the 70s and 80s, and because I'm running out of time, I won't go into them into detail, but basically they were behavioral observations, things that people saw that the hawks were doing. In other words, they'd walk up and the hawk would leave when the person was 400 meters away. They'd look at it in terms of how the hawks would react to when cars went by and things like that. But it was like 1-2 nests. That's where the setback distances came from, because the province was trying to be very precautionary. So we went and kind of repeated all these studies, but got really decent sample sizes. So I'm very quickly going to have to just go through 3 behavioral studies we've done to look at whether or not the setbacks are relevant and whether they're doing their job. So this is the frequency with which the feehaw leaves their nest when we're walking up to check on them. And the vast majority don't leave till you get to within 50 meters. But some leave when you're as far away as 500. And what we found, and the rule that the province used was, well, we want to avoid 95% of flushes. Well, if that's the case, then 413 meters, we would avoid the vast majority of flushing events. We wouldn't cause them, we wouldn't disturb them, we wouldn't make them leave their nest. But we were interested in trying to figure out whether or not how that really plays out. What is the hawk doing? Like, are they really reacting to you or not? So we did an experiment this summer where we visited the hawks, the same hawk, 3 different times. But we visited where we drove up in the truck, we got out, and we stood and watched them from 50 meters, 200 meters, and 400 meters. So here, for example, would be the nest. We got out and watched there. We got out and watched here, got out and watched here. What we're trying to do is simulate what maybe somebody who's maintaining a well might do. Come to it, visit, do some activity for 10 minutes, and what would happen if they did that at 50, 200, or 400. And what we found is some very interesting patterns. So here we have time, minute to first alarm call. So when you stop, they instantly respond if they're at 50 meters. So if you're close to the hawk, they'll give you an alarm call very quickly. But if you're 200 or 400 meters away, it takes them a little bit longer to give that call. If you look at the number of alarm calls, okay, again, it's a higher mean for the close than the medium or the far. So again, there is evidence they definitely are reacting to people, and they do leave the nest, and the closer you get, the greater risk you have. Here's the cool part. This is a landscape with low disturbance. This is a landscape with high disturbance. This is the number of alarm calls they give. The guys, these are the peacock birds, they live in a landscape with lots of activity. They don't give alarm calls near as much when you approach them at exactly the same distance as the guys who live way out in the boonies. So the guys who've never been exposed to people, they basically are scared shitless of you. And these guys who've seen more people on a regular basis, they're less likely to be. So the hawks are acclimating, but there is 2 very different personalities. Hawks that can live in an energy sector landscape, and hawks who maybe could but haven't at this point and aren't used to people very much. We can kind of take that just a couple more. Here we have time spent active during doing costly, basically defending the nest activities, so powered flight, circling overhead, dive bombing your field assistants, versus neutral activities like perching, soaring, and vigilance. And again, the closer you get and moderate, so 250, 200 meters, the hawks are quite upset that you're there. At 400, much less. But again, that same pattern exists in the landscape. Just a couple of last quick things. Now the same thing though is, so they do that, but how often does that happen? Is this something that we really need to be worried about? So one of the things that we did is we put traffic counters out along roads, and then we put video cameras at the nest so that nobody was disturbing it besides the car going by. You know, because a human walking by is one thing, but a car going by is something that the energy sector would be more concerned about. When they have to send a truck out or you know, a piece of equipment to drive by the nest, what would be the impact? So this is just to show you another example of that. So here we have mom on the nest, there's the nest, and it's pointing out, and there's a camera focused on the road. What we do see is periodically a truck will come by and mom leaves either seconds before or seconds after. And one of the things the province is very concerned about is that those accidental flushes kick a chick out when they get out of the nest. It doesn't happen that often, but it does happen. But when you look at it in terms of, again, number of cars that are going by per day and the amount of time that the birds are spending on the nest, there's no relationship. And that's because some are getting used to it and some are not, right? So they flush at about an average rate. But the guys that only have 0 cars per day, when we go out there, we scare the hell out of them and they leave. And so if you send a car by them, they probably will react, but they get so few cars per day, they're not reacting in any strong way. So in summary, quick, the behavioral criteria the province used to create the setback distances, our results are very consistent with what other people found. So if your goal is not to disturb the bird at all, they work. In terms of does that have any implications for population dynamics, we don't. The answer is not. There's not a lot of strong evidence. Okay, they're not. Those behavioral changes are not causing a huge influence in demography that we can measure. Now we have some more things to do. We have to finish this heavy oil analysis where we've got very large trucks going through. That might be a little bit different. We're also looking at prey delivery rates and doing an overall population dynamics model to assess sort of our certainty in some of these things. And that'll be coming out by the summer. So does this mean it'd be okay to put the wells and roads close to feehead nests during the winter? From a footprint perspective, it probably wouldn't be that bad. In other words, they perch on the well pads, they sometimes hunt on them. We've got evidence of that. But the point is, if you do that, you put a well close to a feehead nest, you've now got the problem of going to maintain that well during the summertime. You're going to be precluded from doing that because you are going to create a behavioral disturbance when you go. So the setback in that way, keeping the footprint at least a distance, whether a kilometer is too much is a debatable point, but that footprint needs to be thought about in terms of its footprint and also the activity that will have to happen there. I would go to one of the things, I guess my biggest recommendation and the thing I'm most concerned about is roads and roads and roads. And the reason being, it's not the roads, it's the cars. Because we've had hawks, the adult hawks killed, we've had quite a few juvenile hawks killed by cars. Our burrowing owl research, same thing. So the roads and speed, speed restrictions, those kind of things, I think those are going to be pretty fundamental things that we have to think about. Because the footprint, not such a big deal. I'd like to thank we talked about collaboration. This is from a whole schwack of people, and I want to thank all of them. A whole schwack of undergrads, and these ones in particular who watch way more TV about hawks than you can imagine.